Okay, so today we're going to do a calibration check on an MESA003 actuator, 120 volt, open closed jog. This is a 310 inch-pound actuator mounted onto an 1.25 inch three-piece stainless ball valve. This actuator, the drive shaft connected to the visual position indicator, is a solid shaft, goes all the way through the actuator. So what the output of the actuator is doing is exactly the same as what this shaft is doing. So all the cam adjustments and the rotation of the shaft and everything that you're seeing on the top of the actuator is mimicked directly out the bottom of the actuator. So what the top is doing, the indicator, the valve is doing the same thing. So right now, in looking at how this, how the actuator is, the cover is mounted on the actuator, this window tells you what the position of the valve is. So right now we're roughly about 50% open, and if you look at the valve, you can see we're roughly 50% open. So what I'm going to do is, this is our test box. I'm going to turn on the power on the test box, and I'm going to drive it to a full closed position. So driving it clockwise, and it's going to drive closed clockwise, and then the indicators tell me that it's at the end of travel and everything is good as far as the actuator is concerned. But when I look at the valve itself, the valve is not closed. So the calibration is either changed, or the actuator was mounted differently than the position of the valve, or the actuator may have been removed for installation purposes of the valve. Regardless, doesn't matter. There's a calibration problem. So what we're going to do here is we're going to reset the cams and the travel to bring the actuator into calibration with the position of the valve. So just an FYI is when we ship out completed valve assemblies from our factory here at Max Air, the actuator is fully calibrated for the valve for 0 and 90 degree operation. So typically when you receive these assemblies, you do not have to recal. It should be fully calibrated unless somebody took it apart or you need to change the calibration for whatever the reason. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go through the procedure on how to set this. So we know that just the way I just drove this product, we know that the valve is not in the right position. So this actuator has an 8mm hex drive on the bottom, and it tells you which way to move this shaft to open or close the valve. So what we've got to do is, the valve is not closed far enough. So I'm going to move this in the closed direction, which means I want to drive the actuator this way, and it will drive the valve in a closed position. And I'm watching the valve itself, and I can see that now the valve is fully closed. And now what I have to do is set the travel cams and the auxiliary switch cams. So right now we are in the fully closed position, and I can see by looking at the wiring diagram that the closed position cam is the number 2 cam. And what we're doing here is all of our actuators rotate clockwise to close. So our number 2 cam, I'm going to use a 2.5mm hex key. And if it's quiet enough when you're calibrating these, you can hear the switch and tell when the unit is in the right position. So when I have to reset the travel on the clockwise position, the number 2 cam, what I want to do is get the switch away, get the cam away from the switch, and just slightly snug it up and then pull it to the left until I hear that switch right there. So what that means is now I've got the unit calibrated. The switch should be in the correct position for the end of travel for the clockwise position. I'm going to check that by driving the actuator open. And you can see by looking at this, the valve is driving in an open The valve is driving open, and I'm going to let it drive closed until it stops. So now it's driven to the closed position. The valve is in the closed position, so I know that the number 2 cam is now set correctly. Now what I want to do is to set the auxiliary switch cam so that it trips just about the same time as the end of travel, but a little bit ahead. So looking at the wiring diagram, you can see the number 4 cam is the auxiliary switch for the closed position. We can see that the switch is tripped right now. I'm going to loosen this up and move this off cam. So you can see this switch, the indicator light is tripping. So I'm going to bring this off cam, snug it up slightly, and then pull it to the left until that light comes on right there, and then give it just a little bit more and tighten it down. The reason we're doing that is to make sure that the auxiliary switch leads the end of travel stop on the actuator. If it was behind it, the actuator would stop before the switch tripped and you would lose your auxiliary switch status. So now I'm going to go ahead and check to make sure where everything is running. I'm going to drive it open a little bit. And then I'm going to drive it closed, and in so doing I'll be able to check the drive closed command, the auxiliary switch telling me that it's closed, and also the pilot. When the pilot switch trips, this tells me that the switch cam is actually stopping the actuator. Even though it's energized to drive, when the pilot light turns on, that tells me the drive system is disconnected and now the power is being rerouted over to the auxiliary or to the pilot duty out to let you know that it actually has tripped. So I'm going to go ahead and drive this clockwise, and we should see this will come on as soon as I tell it to move. That's our command switch. The second thing that we're going to see is the auxiliary switch is going to trip, and the third thing we're going to see is the pilot is going to trip. So we're going to drive. We got 1, 2, 3. So you can see that basically your sequence is 1, 2, 3. We'll drive it out and check it again. 1, 2, 3. That now is set correctly. The travel stop is set correctly. The auxiliary switch is set correctly, and the valve is fully closed. So now our closed position is fully calibrated. So now let's go ahead and drive it to the fully open position, and we'll check that. We're driving open. And we've got an auxiliary switch trip and a pilot trip telling me that it is reached, as far as the cam setting is concerned, the actuator has reached its full open position. So let's check the valve. We'll turn the power off. We'll check the valve and we'll see it is not fully open. You can see the ball has got to go a little bit further. So again, I'm going to use our wrench. This time I'm going to run it in the open direction, and I'm going to adjust. I'm going to rotate this slowly until that ball comes around, is in full open bore, maybe a little bit more. So now looking in there, we have a full open bore position. That's in the full, that position of the valve is in the correct place for fully open. Looking at the wiring diagram, our fully open cam is number 1 and the auxiliary is number 3. So we're going to be working with number 1 and number 3 now. So now the actuator going open is going counterclockwise. The indicator is telling us we're in the full open position. And so the cam is rotating the same as the indicator. It's rotating counterclockwise when you're driving in the open position. But we recognize from the way the lights were, it stopped too quickly. So I need to loosen this cam and move it off cam to the left. And again, you can hear when the switch is set correctly. So I'm moving off cam, snug it up slightly, and I'm going to move it to the right until I hear that switch click. Right there. So now we've got the auxiliary, or the counterclockwise open end of travel is in the right position as far as the cam is concerned. I'm going to check that with, we're going to drive it a little bit closed. Then we're going to drive it open and see where it stops. Basically, the switch is telling me it stopped and the ball is in the full open position. We know that the counterclockwise end of travel cam is now set correctly. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the number 3 auxiliary switch cam, and we can see what, looking at the indicator on the auxiliary switch, I can tell when the switch is tripped. So again, I'm moving it off to the left, and I'm going to pull it right until I see this trip. And then a little bit further. Just snug it up. Let's drive it closed a little bit. And again, the proper sequence, what we should see is the counterclockwise open drive command. Then we're going to see it reach the open auxiliary switch, and then we're going to see it reach the pilot. So we should see 1, 2, 3. And let's run it. We got 1, 2, 3. Now the sequence is correct. Everything is set correctly. Looking at the valve, the full open bore position is perfect. So now we've got all 4 cams set correctly, and we can see exactly what's going on. The rotation is correct, the indicators are correct, the valve is in the right position. This actuator is now set. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to drive it fully closed, which is our default position for valve assemblies. And there we go. Valve is in the right position, fully closed. All the indicators are working. This unit is fully calibrated and ready to close up. A word of caution on the set screws on the cams. There's absolutely no pressure on these cams other than the lever on the switch itself, and it's extremely low torque resistance. So you don't have to take and hark down on these 2.5 millimeter set screws. Just a little bit of pressure on it and they're not going to move ever. So you don't have to bend or twist your 2.5 millimeter hex key in order to make sure the settings are correct. So that is the calibration setting on an MESA003 120 volt on-off jog actuator. And remember, don't lick the wires.